DMX and
Yeah,
Jay-Z. That was an
that,
amazing.
that's such an amazing story. They, you don't, and yeah, you don't think of. Well, it's like a lot of things. Our art works in a particular way. Actually the same way that we think of that common law thinks of law more as an art than sort of a objective thing. But Jay-Z tells this story about he's young and he's the headliner at this at a show somewhere, and
It was outside. It was a huge
it's
outside
outside, yeah,
event.
big outside event, and DMX goes on right before him, and he tells the story of DMX being backstage. DMX is older, he's more experienced, he's a lot more intense than Jay-Z. Jay-Z's intense, but DMX is DMX.
Yeah, right.
And he says he's back there and he's got his microphone and he starts growling into the microphone but behind the stage, right? So all the guys are, it's like, hey, DMX, you're up, and everybody's like, all right, hey man, go kill it. And he pulls his microphone up to his mouth and goes, "Urgh." And the crowd knows now
They
it's
know.
DMX.
They know.
Yeah, so they erupt, all the men erupt, and he goes out there and he's just killing it on stage. And about halfway through, he takes his shirt off, and then all the women erupt, right? And so and then he gets to the end and he says, all right, everybody, let's pray. And he leads this entire crowd in prayer.
Everybody's crying.
Crying and bawling, right? Because DMX, dude, that guy, he can preach, he can pray, like he's intense. Yeah, he's a great poet. And and then they look at Jay-Z and they're like, all right, Jay-Z, you're next. And Jay-Z's young and he's like, and if you watch the whole clip, I've seen that whole episode. It's on LeBron's Barbershop. He's like, and I realized I didn't know how to do a stage show. Right, having to go on after DMX. I thought I knew before that, but this guy, he knew how to serve his audience. He knew what his job was, to move his audience. That was the service that he was providing, to move them, and he knew he knew which way he was moving them because he was a Christian. And that's not what Jay-Z talks about. Jay-Z just talks about, I didn't know what my job was until I saw DMX do it, and that's how I learned my job is to serve this audience. And so he says, and I realized my stage shows are terrible.
Yeah,
it's terrible.
Yeah,
right, until I saw it done by an old master. And that understanding of art, and that the understanding of poetry, and the way it develops as you look at how the previous generation did it, you learn everything you can from them, but you learn not just the content, but the way it's done from them, and then you imitate them and try and move the art forward.
Oh, man,
basically the way common law works.
Jason, this is so, what you just said is so interesting, because deconstructionism, which is what we're going through right now, right?
Yeah,
where everything's being deconstructed, is to absolutely try and sever us from our forefathers. It is,
right.
It's trying to kill covenant. We've talked about this before in other shows, where I'm realizing that everything that the world or secularism or Gnosticism or whatever we're talking about, the lack of understanding true metaphysics, is trying to separate you in one way or another from the history line that you're connected to. Like that's right. It's because if it can do that, because ultimately what it's trying to get at is, I think Francis Schaeffer called it, he had two tiers. Had we talked about this last show. There is this whole other that you are not a part of, that is creator, right? He's saying it's outside of creation, and above it. And then there's this other, which is everything that's inside of creation. And history attaches you to the realities of creator and creature, right? And the line between the two and how the two function, right? Because you're telling the story of Genesis all over again. Right. You were made, you were created, right?
And what modernity, when it came along, or the Enlightenment and Enlightenment modernity, it came along and tries to separate or put in a sort of fundamental difference between what's above the line and below the line, but it also moves the line down and adds some creaturely things to that, what's called the noumenal realm, right? So the noumenal realm for Christians, the noumenal realm is God is wholly different than us in his essence, right? But then in his but then he created a world that is analogically related, right? So in his essence, he is a creator and independent in his being, and we are created and dependent in our being. And what's interesting is that is the exact distinction. That is that's where Blackstone goes when he starts talking about the law. Blackstone wrote commentaries on English law, I think is what it's called. It sort of set the standard for all of the definitions that we still use in American law, but he was doing it in England. He goes that when he goes to the justification of the common law system, he goes to the creator-creature divide, right? And he says, we are dependent, therefore we live according to laws that, and the first place that law comes from is what he calls nature, right? But we post Enlightenment use the word nature to mean like we look out at nature, right? Nature is out there and it's like the trees and the everything, right? And natural, when we talk about the laws of nature, we talk about things we observe that we can expect to happen again. Well, the older way that natural law was used, what it meant was God, our nature as created beings, is wholly dependent for our existence upon God. Therefore, he gets to define who we are, what our nature is, and then the natural law is how that nature ought to be used in the world.
So here's, right? I can't remember, I got this from David Fowler, who's going to be joining us next week to talk about common law. And he's in this, I don't even know where he's gotten this from, but I'll ask him when we have him on. He says, Blackstone stated his Christian thesis with unmistakable clarity. And he goes in to say, this is what Blackstone said: man considered as a creature must necessarily be subject to the law of his creator, for he is entirely a dependent being. A state of dependence by inevitably oblique the inferior to take the will of him on whom he depends as the rule of his conduct. And consequently, as a man depends absolutely upon his maker for everything, it is necessary that he should in all points conform to his maker's will. This will of his maker is called the law of nature.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Right.
Exactly.
So that's that even in the later definitions of when they start getting into arguments about the law and its nature, Blackstone comes to the defense of common law, saying this is a fundamentally Christian.
Yes,
it's birthed out of a Christian understanding. It's a fundamentally Christian way of approaching civic law. Right? So common law is.
I want to get to common law in just a second. So man, there's so much about this I want to talk about because I'm understanding. So I came into this theonomically. So I came in reading the Old Testament in charismatic circles. The Old Testament is, especially black churches, we identify a lot with the children of Israel because of our historical backdrop. So we have so much, we're rooted so much in Old Testament theology. Of course, we have a picture of Christ too, but our identity really, as far as the people in the story, we see ourselves a lot like the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, having to go through battles and fight and win, and God been our side, and we shouldn't have won any of them because we're such a small group of people. Like we really identify. So we are steeped a lot in Old Testament theology, so we stay there a lot. So Deuteronomy is one of the books that we really embrace, and we preach a lot of law in our churches, which is, I'm totally fine with that in the right context. But because of that, theonomy was really easy for me to grasp. It wasn't hard for me to grasp theonomic law because God's a lawgiver. Everything comes from him. What I didn't, and so when I got theonomy, what I didn't understand about law, and this is what you were talking about earlier, was the poetry in it. So we had a context of law that was almost of do this, don't do that kind of situation. But the way that Blackstone and a lot of the other early writers, I think you had Cook, and you had, I was trying to think of Henry, Bacton. That's who I'm thinking of. So you got Henry Bacton, and he kind of starts the way, I think it was 1254 all the way up to Cook, and then Blackstone moves in after that and absorbs all of his writings and starts writing more in, well, he has better vision, into common law, a treatise on it. But the way that these guys are understanding natural law wasn't just the idea of thou shalt not. It was the idea of this is how life works.
Right. Yeah.
That was fascinating to me.
Right. It's a completely different approach. That the law is a description of what a true and full life is.
Yeah.
And because it's so when Jesus comes and he is the Word incarnate, right? What you learn is that all of the law was a description of Jesus. Right? It was a description of the way God lives. And so the law is an invitation to live the way God lives, live a life like God's, which is a true, full, complete life. Now we do it as creatures. He does it as a creator, right? And so the distinction ends up being made between the communicable and incommunicable attributes theologically. In a common law setting, though, what you're trying to discover is what it is to what destroys our ability to live as a human life, right? What is dehumanizing, and then and as we learn that wisdom, the law puts up fences at those dehumanizing places, right? That's a Christian understanding of the law as boundaries, right? The law is the boundaries on life, right? Beyond this is death, this on this side is life. So and then there's the restitutionary law, there's civil law, that is when you can't just work things out with your neighbors and you need the law to step in, right? There's a certain kind of law, and then there is judicial law, which is when you've committed a crime, right? So there's the law ends up being carefully divided, but all of it is about how does life for individuals and life for communities work, and what are the edges that become dehumanizing, right? Death embrace edges, and how do we put up those boundaries?
Do you think that part of our, I always say that a person who works with God's world and materials is able to understand boundaries better than people who don't? So people who are always working on softwares that there's no boundaries, they can kind of go beyond what they want to. They think that they can, right?
Yeah.
But a person who works with wood understands where things break at. A person who works with metal understands where things bend at and how far they can bend. So, when we're talking about law and the beauty of law, which you were talking about earlier, Blackstone is talking about when he's working through common law and natural law, he's working through the idea of how flowers, there's a law to how they develop, how they become erect, and how they get beauty. And so long as they follow that law and that law works out in them, the world is beautiful because of it. Right.
Right.
And so
that law, that when law is functioning properly, it's the equivalent of, like, clearing the brush overhead so that sunlight can get to the flower, because the flower needs sunlight, right? So when it's not getting sunlight, it can't live, and so you have to remove the things that are getting in the way of the sunlight.
Yeah. So they didn't think law was prevalent inside of nature itself. Like, it is, God's law is everywhere in everything. And the beauty that we see is because of that law, right? They didn't have a separate understanding, oh, this is civil law. This was all connected to, again, how the world is functioning and operating around us, so that it was observable, because in one sense or another, God has actually placed his law also in man's heart. So they know that this is right and they know that this is wrong, right? That's what Paul talks about.
Yeah. Calvin makes the distinction between natural law and conscience. And he says natural law is how natures flourish, how something living according to its nature flourishes, and conscience is the writing of that natural law on the heart of mankind, right? So that that God has written on our conscience the what causes us to flourish and what doesn't. Now we go against our conscience, but that conscience is binding in the sense that it is from the hand of God, right? So it is the God's law written on our heart is binding in that sense that we can see natural law,
but
at work.
But then just thinking, I know I don't want to jump too far ahead, but as soon as I start thinking about this, as soon as I start reading more Blackstone, I realize that we are absolutely at a very interesting place right now, because when I argue or I talk to someone in Christianity, people who are in my circles, they argue for a form of autonomy that is completely opposed to God's world. You have to, by definition, I'm starting to believe this, by definition, you have to be some form of theonomic. You have to be. You can't not be that way if you understand justice, if you understand there's a law to marriage, a law of love, right? It's still a law, right? You can't escape that. And there's a way to do it, and there was a way not to do it, and then there's also sanctions from it, because that's what covenant is. It's built into the system, right?
Well, I think, though, what has happened is that the word theonomy has been separated from the covenant in a lot of people's understanding.
Well, if they're even covenantal, first of all,
right? Well, a lot, but you've got non-covenantal theonomists.
I don't like those guys.
I love everyone.
I love them. I just say I don't like them.
Yeah. But you have it, but that is because I think the majority of American Christians are not functioning in a covenantal context, or that they are, because the world is a covenantal place, but it's invisible to them. They actually are thinking more like Enlightenment. So what happens in the change in the Enlightenment is that you start getting this idea of an ideal law code that needs to be imposed in the moment, right? So so people start working on ideal law codes, and then those ideal law codes are brought forward and then imposed by coercive force, right? And many theonomists talk about the law in that same sort of way. They just say, but it's God's law that's the ideal that we impose by coercive force, right? So that we can just walk in and place the civil laws of Israel onto, say the state of South Dakota, and boom, by coercive force, apply it, right? Now if you said, was this what you want to do? They might say, well, no, not ideally, but
I don't know any theonomists that think like that, Jason.
Right. But that's how they talk, right?
Who? The lead theonomists don't, like the people who are writing.
No, I'm talking about the outside of a covenantal context.
Oh, okay. Right? I was trying to figure out. So would you say somebody who is like, let's think of a particular group. You have kind of the Jesus movement people who are the kind of charismatics who are wanting to have the they think about dominion.
7 dominions. That's a really good example, right? So it's a non-covenantal theonomy, right? So what do? Well, we need to take the 7 mountains back,
right?
And then we can apply God's law, on, right? So they're thinking manipulatively, coercively, in the same sort of way, right? That's an Enlightenment understanding. But whereas if you're thinking in a creator-creature covenantal context, right? God is wholly other in essence, in being. But then he is fully present. He's fully immanent, fully present in creation, and the Holy Spirit is guiding history, right? And the covenant is the terms by which God interacts with the world, right? So there are secret things involved, but they belong to God. the covenant belongs to us and to our children, and we live according to God's covenant, wherein he's promised when, where, how he has bound himself to be in relationship and in presence and all of those things. So
I need to restore the word theonomy. I just have to, because you're right. I don't think people think about it that way, but I don't know. So when I think about theonomy, I'm thinking about what it says in the name, theoname, God's law, right? That's what I'm thinking about. God's objective standard, sovereignty of God is what I'm thinking about.
But how language works is you've got the literal meaning, and then you've got all of the things that it suggests.
Sure.
Because it that is so. If you think of theonomy the same way, say, Alfred did,
or common law does.
So King Alfred, who's the beginning, the establishment of common law, there were a number of different English kingdoms before him, but the Vikings came in. The Vikings were just pirates, and they came in and they conquered and killed a number of people, a number of kings, and so they were left with just a single king along the southern coast of Ireland that still had royal blood, and it was Alfred. And he was, I believe, he was the seventh son, and his 6 older sons and his father were all killed or died of disease caused by one of the battlefield diseases. So he ends up the king of 3 kingdoms. 3 kingdoms are joined together under him, and under his grandson, all of the 7 kingdoms of England end up joined together. And he says, okay, so the law of the land has been completely broken down by invasions, and so he writes what are called the it's called the Doom Book. And Doom is the Anglo-Saxon for law, so it's his law code, right? And what he does is he takes the law of the 3 kingdoms that he's now the kingdom of Mercia. There's 3 kingdoms. He takes their law codes and he combines them together. He says, because they are currently, they have jurisdiction. Then he takes some of the Roman law code, because the Romans had ruled England, and he saw himself in many ways as taking over the Roman rule of England, because they had combined England, and now he finds himself in a situation where many tribes are combined, many kingdoms are combined under him. And so he says there's sort of an imperialism. So he takes the imperial law of Rome, which once had jurisdiction in England, the 3 kingdoms, the law of the 3 kingdoms, and then the book of Deuteronomy, because he says Jesus is Lord of all. He's the King of Kings, and so his law also has jurisdiction on the soil of England. And he combines them together and writes together the law code that becomes the beginning of the common law system. But part of that is because he took the system of law of Deuteronomy and says, this is how our law is going to function. And that was the revolutionary part, was taking the system of law. And how that works is Deuteronomy, and we mentioned this in the last one, Deuteronomy is is Moses having judged according to the 10 commandments for 40 years in the wilderness. They're getting ready to go in, and he says, let me lay out the wisdom that I have learned judging hard cases according to the 10 commandments, right? 3 sections of Deuteronomy. The middle section is broken down into 10 different sections that are each according to the 10 commandments. Here's the wisdom I have gained for 40 years of making hard judgments, because he only made the very hardest judgments, right? Yeah. There were all sorts of judges making judgments that never made it to him because they were simple. Moses spent his day with the very hardest cases. And so he lays out, how did the 10 commandments form my thinking on some of the very hardest cases? And he says that case law is now authoritative as case law, and you're supposed to take it and learn it, and the judges are supposed to internalize it. And so now they can make hard judgments, but then record their hard judgments, pass them around to the other judges so that they're also all learning the wisdom, and the law code grows and is refined. And so Alfred takes what is legal, the laws of the English kingdoms, the law of Rome, and the law of Deuteronomy, that they're all legally binding, they have jurisdiction on English soil, pulls them together and says, now let's move forward with this understanding of how the art of law develops.
The trusting poetry that the Holy of it, right?
Yeah, right. Trusting that the Holy Spirit is guiding history forward, right? That the Holy Spirit's presence guides history forward, and our law code can grow in wisdom, grow and become closer and closer to the way that life flourishes. Right?
Okay, pause right there. Because you said something that I don't want to miss, and this is something I need to lock in myself. Trusting that the Holy Spirit is working through history to do what? Right? Because that's super important, because if you have an eschatology that doesn't believe where the end is going to go, then it's hard for you to believe that the Holy Spirit is working in history that way, right?
Right.
So you have to.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And this is where, they didn't have the eschatological debates yet that we've had since. So they didn't have dispensationalism, right? It hadn't been invented yet. So there was an understanding that God was maturing people, right? He was maturing his people, and he was conquering the whole earth. Now, how the mathematics of how that all works and all of that, they had incredibly brave missionaries, and they loved to tell, especially on English soil, they loved those missionary stories. They would tell the story. There's Saint Andrew. Saint Andrew he ends up crucified on a cross that's sideways, right? So he's kind of hung up on the cross sideways. That ends up in the Scottish national flag, right? Because they loved those missionary stories. So Saint Andrew's cross is right at the center of the Scottish national flag. So the missionary mindset that they had was, well, we send out missionaries, people get converted like we did, right? St. Augustine, the missionary, he shows up in England. He's sent by Gregory the Great. He shows up in England, not even really speaking English. He stops and gets an English translator in France, and they show up and convert en masse over the course of a couple of years of real intense kind of revival missionary success, and then long-term success. They overtake the Anglo-Saxons with the gospel, and so by the time you get to the 900s, they're still telling the story. But great, the first thing that Alfred does when he begins trying to establish a new learning center, because England was known as the place where all of the great schools were and all of the great learning was, all the great libraries were. Well, the Vikings just decimated the libraries of England, burned them down, stole them, because they were worth a lot of money, and a lot of the great teachers had been taken to Europe because they were exporting teachers. Well, so Alfred comes along, and learning is kind of at a new low, and he says we need to reestablish English learning. The first book he translates back into English is the pastoral the pastorals of Gregory the Great, right? The how to be a good pastor. And he says, this, I want every member of every royal house to read this. So he translates it into English, and he says, because we are also the servants of God as the rulers of the people, right? So he wants them to think like pastors, right? You represent Jesus to the people. You have to have self-control. You have to be completely resistant to bribery. You're right, all of that.
Yes,
right?
Elders. Yeah,
elder qualifications, right? He is what he's thinking of for all the all the barons, everybody that rules in England. And then he begins working on the law code, saying, but we also need this wisdom. And so everybody has to learn to read both Latin and Anglo-Saxon to be a part of the royal court, right? He says we have to be learned, because the law comes to us as something that is studied, meditated on, and then acted upon, and then we will grow in wisdom as a people over generations until our law code reflects God's creation of us and our nature more and more and more, and we mature into a greater people over generations.
You know what's funny about that? I mean, it's not funny, but that's actually what was expected of a king of Israel. The king of Israel had to write the law, know the law, and study in the law, so that he could actually lead people well, right? Like he had to know what was required, because in one sense, a prophet, priest, and a king all have, in one way or another, they are go-betweens between God and man, right? And so they have to represent the people to God and God to the people one way or another, right? Either in the civil area, even in the liturgical area, so they had to know what was required of man by God for them to be better humans and to judge humans, and they had to know what their responsibilities and duties were to God for these people, right?
Right.
And so, apart from, I think it might have been Henry Bacton that said that no king should submit to people. The king should not submit to people, but to God, because God is the one who created the authority for kings, right? So, and he had to submit to God's law, because God's law is the thing that keeps him in check as he represents the people, right? Because otherwise you got people who have put him there, right? And if his authority ultimately, this is Enlightenment stuff, if his authority ultimately comes from the people, then the people can change how that authority should operate. But if his authority as a ruler comes from God, then he has to submit to what God's standard is over against, even if the people would push against it, right? Which is a very important distinction as it comes to law. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, that's exactly the distinction, and this is where, you're right. You've got to be a theonomist. It's because it's never a question of if there's a God, it's just which God, right? And in democracy, demos is the God. The people are the God, and so you're submitting to them, and they're the ones that create the power, and then they're the ones who control the power. In a Christian understanding, God is the one who sets up the authorities in the world, and their job is to represent God to the people, and then represent the people to God, right? They're a representative situation, so they can represent the people to God and go and repent of sins, right? David does that, right? But then David's sin also affects the people, right? So that there's a deep connection. I mean, it's the same, and it's an analogy. It's analogously the same relationship that a husband and a wife have. Right. So that's why when David wants to write, or when Solomon says, now I'm going to write my great thesis, my great thesis on being a king, he writes the Song of Solomon, right? It's wisdom literature for kings. How do you treat a woman? That's how you treat your people. Right? That is, so Adam failed in the garden as a king because he didn't protect his wife, right? He failed in the garden as a king because he didn't he didn't kill the dragon, right? That he was failing as a husband and as a king and
as a priest, and a prophet.
Is a priest, right? So he was failing in all of the ways because he held all three offices at once. So people are always like, well, what was created first? Well, they were all created at the same time. Adam is the king. He's the civil ruler, he's the priest, and he's the husband all at once. There is not one of them is not earlier than all the others. In my well-informed opinion.
I agree with that one. So when we talk about,
but
go ahead.
That's one of the areas that a lot of modern theonomists get into trouble, because there's a tendency among theonomists to put the family as the foundation of all the other magistrates.
No, I think I hold to, the only thing I hold to is, and this is me agreeing with you and then making the distinction between the family being the only one that populates the others. So,
100%.
So right? the authority the family, structures are all together at the same time.
I think the reason that a lot of modern conservatives get traction there is actually they're not they're saying the family is primary, and that's not true, but the family is the place where we have jurisdiction. And so it is primary for husbands, right? A husband,
right.
So it's his primary jurisdiction. So that's the place where he can change things. And if they understood, if that's what they mean by primary, then 100%,
right.
I'm with them.
Well, I'm trying to figure out, like, what do you mean by primary? Because when I think about it, I don't see, when Adam is made, the crown and glory of creation, all those things are happening simultaneously. He's not operating outside of one of those, first and then the other, right? So the fall, it's like he's a prophet, right? he didn't do a good job there, right?
Yeah, he's a failed prophet,
failed king, failed priest, right? And all three of those,
failed husband,
right? All those. I think I want to make a distinction though between. So you got the family, and I don't know. This is me from reading core guys on this. So I would say Rush Dooney. I don't read a lot of Greg Bonson on theonomy. I think he fought more of the battles and setting out a principal case of theology for it. So you got commentaries from Gary North and Rush Dooney that are really laying out, and Gary DeMar, who are laying out way more of a foundation for theonomy, where I think Bonson is arguing the principles of it more than anybody else. And he does some great exegesis. I'm not saying anything bad about Bonson because he's a beast in it. But I think that the establishing self-government in one way not above all, but in the fact that if you don't have self-government, none of the other ones operate. Right?
100%.
So there's like broken links that ruin all the other spheres at the end of the day.
And I know they all believe as well that the establishment of self-government comes by believing the gospel. Right?
Exactly.
Right? That Jesus and the Spirit, the Father by Jesus through the Spirit interacts with us personally as individuals, that the judgment at the end of time is personally as individuals, and that the establishment of self-government is in the internal rebirth of people by the gospel, right?
Amen.
They all believe that. I do believe that Rushdoony had a tendency to put the family as primary, and a lot of the patriarchalist movement tends to put the family as primary, and I think that is an error of categories.
I wasn't so mad at Rushdoony for necessarily that as much as I was for him not acknowledging the highest, the extreme importance of the church, right? Like, so there was I think his focus on the family was essential because of what was happening at the time, but he didn't put the buttress. So those spheres, if you draw one smaller than the other, you get into trouble. And so, you know what I mean? Like you could draw one bigger, one smaller. It's like, actually these spheres are, just like your genes, they all flow and they all need each other in order for your whole body to be able to operate. Like you were saying earlier, it's not like one came before the other. It's like, which one came first, lungs or noses?
Right. Yeah, exactly. But I think though that the spheres, the spheres are jurisdictions, right? That's the question of sphere is, and they're actually layered on top of one another.
Yeah.
And so coming at the spheres, the mental picture we get in our mind is often like, three circles that are each have their spheres, but it's really more like three circles laid right on top of one another. Each of them are a jurisdiction that God established.
I like to even use the word governments. right? Like,
yeah, governments. That's a great way to put it, right? They're governments, but they are layered right on top of one another.
Yeah, that's right.
And they each have their they each bump up against the edges in our lives because they're not all authoritative over all of us.
That's right.
Over everything about us. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason that people lay them not necessarily on top of each other, although I think most people would agree, is because of where they interact depending on what's going on. Right. So it's like, well, when does this sphere bump into this other sphere? Well, at this point, right? Right. And when did they? Right. So, but here's what I want to ask you real quick. Just I want to try and wrap, because I want to talk about law, which I think we've done a little bit, and then I want to talk about common a little more, because here's something that I want to talk about with common law real quick. So the common part of law is really, Jason, you're gonna have to help me with this, because I don't know how you can't be so it's two things. I think you have to by default be theonomic in the way that we're talking about it, and then the other thing is you have to be postmillennial. And here's why. Right. So law is theonomic, and then the other side is postmillennial, because common law is being worked out in history to a particular maturity to expand the gospel in the world.
Right. I think what you would say is you can't be Gnostic. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, well, see, that's worse than what I said, though, because I was being kind. You're saying if you're not postmillennial, you're Gnostic. I just want to say that's what you just said.
No. There are other non-Gnostic. I'm postmillennial, right down to my little pinky toes, right? Yeah. I love postmillennialism, but there are other non-Gnostic eschatologies.
I don't know them.
Well, right?
I don't know them. I don't know.
So if you read Spurgeon on eschatology, he's premillennial.
Yeah, but he's a Baptist.
Gnostic at all.
He's Baptist, so he's Gnostic by default. Say I'm wrong. Oh. Say I'm wrong.
He's Gnostic in practice, maybe. I don't know. Not by default.
Well, okay. All right. Not by default, in practice. Okay.
His sacramental theology, his sacramental practice is. Man, you're getting me in trouble.
I am. Yeah, because
that's all right. I've been getting you in trouble other times. I
agree with you, though. Ultimately, I agree with you.
That the problem is that there's a Gnostic metaphysic assumed underneath that gets in the way of being able to have, I think, both the patience, but also to work within the systems, the authorities that God has set up. Right, we become revolutionaries because we think there isn't hope for the systems that God established. Right, we don't believe that courts can be converted. Right, because only individuals can be converted in Gnosticism, because it has to do with ideas, and so then everything else has to be done by coercion. Right, and that's the Gnostic assumption that underlies modernism, underlies communism, underlies socialism, fascism, underlies all of the of the revolutions.
Go ahead.
Is that individuals can get the right ideas in their head, and they can be dealt with in a converting manner. Everything else has to be coercion.
This is
Christianity is a converting religion. It converts everything.
Thank you. That's what I was waiting for you to say, is that it converts everything, because I have friends who I love dearly who will say things like, Jesus didn't come to change the culture. He came to change men, right? And for me, that is a fallacy on its face, because the assumption there is that man and culture are somehow, this separate thing. And they will want to say, well, eventually culture will eventually change because man are changed. Well, then why not just say, because here's the thing, when some people start talking about Jesus came to save people somehow from the world, I want to flip out, because the world is his too.
Yeah. But I think, so here's where I would identify the error, though, is when you say he came to save man, not culture. Culture, I think, is an enlightenment category.
We talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, corporate man did he come to save corporate man? Or did he come to say, because we're not made in the image of an individualistic God, right? We're made in the image of a God who is one and three. Is man restored such that man and his corporate identities are saved? Or do we have to flee our corporate identities, and is there no hope for corporate man? Now the category of corporate man is a covenantal category that has been almost lost, right? I mean, nationalism was a fake. Nationalism was an attempt to make a fake version of corporate man, right? To take one kind of corporate relationship and make it primary above all others.
Okay, you got to talk about that, because you're the one who got me thinking about this, which is why I went to go back and study World War I all over again, which is Paul Johnson's book, Modern Modernity,
Birth of the Modern, or no, Birth of the Modern is the one in the 1800s, and then Modernity,
that's it,
is the one in the early 1900s. Paul Johnson's one.
Yeah, but that book, because what he talked about and you talked about, and I kind of put these two things together, which was, and I think when we had Thomas Price on here, he talked about it too. He really talked about, Thomas Price is the one who kind of put the all of it together for the beginning of me, where he talks about, this is dealing with common law, man, and theology was growing and maturing in such a way that there was a language finally to talk about these things that we had never had before in history with the world, right? The whole common man. And this is culminating up into a point where where was the marker on that? What was it? At post-Enlightenment, was it that what the marker was?
In terms of the linguistic development?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that you begin getting a turn away from it right in the generation before Kant.
Okay.
A turn into a new, so Descartes really tries to develop a new language or move the language in a secular direction.
So what ends up happening is now you have this kind of Christian culture permeating the world, and then you see this kind of like this dip in there because of this new metaphysic that's being introduced. And then come before World War I, turn of the century now, you have Einstein who's helping with this, you have Freud who's helping with this. Come the turn of the century, being that form of communication started slipping and the reality started slipping, they had to replace that. Nations had to replace that bond, that grip that was keeping us together to communicate, that was forming relationships with people. They had to replace that with something. And so what they end up replacing that with was nationalism.
Yeah.
What was it that keeps people together to give their all to the nation? Well, national pride, right?
National pride, yep.
And so when you get that, then you get a new religion. So you have one religion that's slipping out, right? And because of this new metaphysic, and this new metaphysics brings in a whole new form of religion for nations to bond people together, and almost because that new metaphysics make them forget about the humanity of others and bind together for a whole new purpose, which is that nation becoming some form of God, right? That's what Hitler embodied ultimately with what he did in the second half, the second beginning of the turn of the century, right? In the World War II. So you're right. You don't, whenever you get to this place where Christianity isn't the founding metaphysics, something else has to rise in place to bring in this. And we don't know how steeped in nationalism that we are, even in America right now, to the point that is what's driving the, you talked about earlier about the power pushing down, the imposing of law versus the gospel, which changes in the whole system because of transformed hearts, right? You get this national identity and then this top-down imposement of it, and then you get the people who rise up against it. What they want to do is impose a different idea of what nationalism should look like, but they're still both fighting over nationalism.
Right. So you have, this is like the 1619 project, 1618 project.
Yeah, 1619 project.
1619. The reason that they are effective is because we still have nationalist assumptions. They come in and they say, hey, let me tell you about something terrible that your nation did. That's you, man. That's you. That's because we're nationalists, right? If our identity is wrapped up in the fact that we're an American, then they're threatening our identity and they're saying you're the bad guy then, right? Now whether they're historically accurate or not, I don't even think that's the important question. If Christians are threatened when they discover that America did something wrong in their fundamental identity, then they need to repent and say, whew, that was a close one. I'm glad God revealed to me that I have that temptation towards a national pride, right? Taking identity, that's what pride is, right? You take an identity in something that defines who you are, right? And that's where your pride is. That's why we're told to boast in no one but Christ Jesus, right? That's where our pride resides, is in Christ Jesus, right? That's where our that's the only thing that we can boast in, and it's not us, it's outside of us, it's what God has done, right? And so when I think God is revealing to the church a lot of nationalistic pride. Now what people will hear when I say that, because I've been trying to figure out how do you because there's like a Christian nationalist movement now, right? Where people are trying to push for Christian nationalism. And what people are hearing is I should be a good patriot. And that patriotism is a virtue, right? But patriotism and Christian nationalism are not, or that nationalism is sneaking something in that Christians need to say no to, right? Just like if I said, I'm a Christian, Christian, I don't know if there's what's a word for taking pride in your own race, right? Christian racist, but
yeah, no,
doesn't, where it's like that we're not supposed to take pride in our race, right? Or pride in our nationality, right? We can
Black power,
embrace it. Yeah, right, exactly, right? We can embrace it. We can be grateful for it.
Black excellence, you see that same thing,
yeah, right. And but human excellence, no matter what race, should inspire everyone of every race, right? You look at I mean, I was raised on the stories of the gentleman that used the peanut to invent so many things.
Carver,
George Washington Carver, right? Yeah. I was raised on that story. I remember my parents telling me that story when, to encourage me to work harder in school. Like, look, George Washington Carver, look how many ways he figured out how to use the peanut, right? That's what we want for you. We want you, whether I don't remember when I learned that he was black or not. That didn't come up. I just learned that this is a man that worked hard, that blessed people, that didn't give up, right? That saw the possibilities of a peanut, right? I was raised on that story. And that is black excellence, because it's human excellence. And that's just that should inspire everyone. And it shouldn't bother us, and I mean, I don't think the phrase black excellence should bother us either, right? It was like, yep, that is black excellence.
But way to go. The reason it's bothering,
as soon as you start taking pride in it, that I think is what's being snuck in, the same way Christian nationalism is sneaking something in. Is what do you take pride in?
That's what I was going to say.
Anything but Jesus. So
and I think part of what it's being used, I'm gonna tell you, I appreciate the idea of black excellence. Okay, first of all, right? Because because I understand what they're trying to say and what they think they're saying. But the problem that I have with it is that it's used as a marker to excommunicate other people out. It's not used to bring other people in. If it was used more to do that, then I'd be like, oh, that's dope, right? Like, absolutely. And I think there's ways to do that. I think at some point it was meant to say, hey, we are trying to be part of the narrative. We have to have a conversation on that, because that's a whole nother thing.
Totally. Well, like you pointed out to me, so when I'm in the Toby Nwingwe, the rapper out of North Texas. Just right. I love his beats, right? Creates incredible beats. I like the way he raps, and his wife's a good rapper. And I love that it's a husband-wife duo rapping, and
he's about his family, super pro-black, right?
Yeah, right. And you said, well, hey, I was it black nationalism? You're like, he's sneaking in some black nationalism. I was unfamiliar with it.
Yeah.
So then I went and looked it up. Like, oh yeah, he is sneaking in a little bit of that. right. It's not something I'd run into before. And it took basically one Wikipedia search to learn what it was. Like, oh yeah, he is sneaking that in. But it's not, I mean, it's not my temptation. Black nationalism's not my temptation.
Well, it might not be your temptation, but it might be forced upon you.
Right. It might be. Now I'll be aware of it. And at the same time, it's not something he's pushing front and center. I think it's something that's maybe an assumption in the background. So there isn't, but it's like a lot of things, right? What are we threatened by? It shouldn't be. There should be very few things that we're threatened by, right? We can look at something and say, like, okay, where do I parse out these things, right? So we can say, what about this is good? What about this is bad? That's actually where we learn the wisdom. When we're threatened, we retreat into tribalism. We retreat. And I mean, I think it's just as dangerous to flee the world as it is to be of the world. Right.
Amen.
We're told to be in the world and of the world, and that's where safety is. Right. Safety is being in the world and of the world, because our safety is covenantal safety always. So it's safety is in obedience.
That's Jesus.
So when we retreat from the world, yeah, exactly. When we retreat from the world, I think it's just as dangerous as, being of the world.
And so I don't want to lose sight in this, because I'm just tracking how we got here. Ultimately, it was the understanding of history and common law being, in order for you to really, again, I don't want to, maybe I'm being too strict in how I'm marking this out, but you have to believe that God is working out history in a particular way, in time and in space, and in this current world that we're in, to bring it to a particular end on this world that doesn't push for some sort of exit strategy from it. It is actually being worked out in time and space. And when you look at common law is being able to see how God is doing that in time and space with his word, right? So you got Alfred the Great using Deuteronomy, right?
Right.
And saying, okay, and God has given him wisdom. This is so important. Like, with wisdom is for you to see the situation and to know how God's word applies directly to that situation that you're in, and to be able to bring about a fruitful outcome because of it, right? And so Alfred the Great is sent here with God's word, with 3 different countries, right? And able to synthesize, because of the scripture. It's like, oh, this is how we're going to do this. God's word is going to be at the post. It's going to be at the top. And we already have law. So long as the grace of God that's given to man in these situations meets the biblical requirement, we should keep those things and those laws because of natural revelation, right? That's there that God has given. So he's not acknowledging that. He's absolutely acknowledging that, and say, how do we bring it in line with how God has designed man to function and flow, right? And so history, and this is, we'll get to kind of American law at some point here, but history, if you don't have a understanding perspective of history and what God is doing in history, then you miss out the maturity of man through time and space in history.
Right. And I think that's what, so the assumption that the system of law, that the Bible makes is that God is with his people, maturing them with a particular end in mind, right? And whether it's there's different ways that you find this put throughout the theology, the history of theology, but it's the restoration of the garden, the restoration of Adam, the return of man to the authority that he lost in the garden. Or sometimes you get people talking about that God is maturing them to replace the angels, right? To put them into the position that was once held by angels. They're going to judge angels, and so he's moving them towards that end. Humanity as a race is being moved towards that particular end. And that understanding is that God works in history to do that, right? That in history, he's working to do that. He's always worked in history. And what you often get in the people discussing is that God worked in history covenantally in the past, but now he works vertically, right? He worked horizontally in the Old Testament. He works vertically in the New Testament, right? Now he connects with people directly. The church is only made up of people that are regenerate. You've got this assumption that now there's a pure, there's a pure group of people that have the essence of all of it already, and they're just waiting it out, right? They're hopefully trying to grab some other brands from the fire, right? But that in the Old Testament, God worked horizontally in history, but then the Holy Spirit came, and now God works
just vertically and directly,
right? Yeah, very individualistically. And
that's really good, Jason.
Yeah, so and that's where I think that's kind of some of those Gnostic assumptions are at work. But common law says, no, we believe God is still at work in us and that we've got maturing to do. And so we're going to set up a law code that is not based on ideals that we brought down, but what is legal now and how can we mature our understanding of legal law, mature our use of the law, and leave it better than we found it, right? Leave the law better than we found it.
When 2020 happened, would you think that if we had a better understanding of what common law was, we would have been able to understand what Romans 13 is? So, you got all of us. Go ahead.
I don't do this very often, but let me read you a quote about
tell me what book you're reading it from so I can buy this book while you're talking.
This is the one that I showed you at the beginning. It's the Shorter Cambridge Medieval History. So he's telling the story of the Magna Carta, right? And so you've got this really interesting series of circumstances where Richard the Lionheart is captured. King John takes over, or he's supposed to. John the Usurper is, I think, now what he's called. He takes over while his brother is gone, and then and there's but he was not. Richard kept everybody in line by loyalty because he loved his people. He was great on the battlefield. He'd protected them. He'd done wonderful things for them. So the taxes were a little bit high. Higher than they had been, but people loved Richard and they knew that he had what was best for England in mind. So he only raised taxes for their own good and would lower them again when that was done. Right?
Can we get one of them?
They believed that about Richard. Yes, right. Well, but then John lacked his brother's attractive qualities. Right? He wasn't as good looking. He was bad on the battlefield. He lost every battle he ever entered. And then he would raise taxes anyway. He was manipulative. He had a way of using, basically finding the unscrupulous people and making them the tax collectors. And
is that volume 2, by the way?
This is volume 2. Yeah.
Okay.
And so he had a way of So he became a tyrant because he was. So it says this is the quote. There was a common law and administration which called for the loyalty of the people, as well as a king that called for the loyalty of the people. Beneath violence and impulsiveness, hatred and selfishness, personal and class interest, there existed a sense that there was a public duty in the function of government, but the temperamental tyranny of John divided the feelings between obedience to the head of the state and defense of the law and legal rights, right? So that the people were divided. You read the writings of the time. Well, we're supposed to submit, and the head of state is doing one thing, and the law is doing another thing. And how do we choose between when the head of state does something illegal? What does submission look like? That's what they're struggling with. That's exactly the question that we began struggling with in 2019. Wait, the law says this, but the people in charge say this. What does submission look like? Which authority do we submit to when the authorities come into conflict with one another? So we're not the first people that have struggled with this. What happened was the church tried to put in Stephen Langton as archbishop, and the king at that point refused and blockaded the church's appointment of a new archbishop. The archbishop was going to come in and solve the problem, but he knew that Stephen Langton was a common law guy and was going to say the law is the authority over the king. So to submit, we have to obey the law when the king disobeys it. So he blockaded Stephen Langton's appointment. And so the Pope excommunicates England as a whole, right? And so now they lock the doors to the churches. They all of this stuff because the Pope had said, I'm excommunicating the king, right? I'm excommunicating the king and the kingdom until he stops acting illegally, acting like he's the one that gets to put the bishops in when that's the church's job, right? And so and that brought to the forefront what was actually going on when the church insisted that and had a clear understanding. No, the king is under the law. We obey the law because that's what submission looks like. Because the law, the written law of the land, or it wasn't written. That's what ends up coming out of this. This is when they start writing things down. The law of the land is in the public vows and in the public judgments. That law is over the king. And so if the king disobeys it, in order to remain submissive to Romans 13, we have to obey the law and disregard the king when he becomes a tyrant, right? So the argument was submission to the law when the king disregards it is what Romans 13 is talking about.
Because ultimately the question is, how do we submit to God when we have two competing authorities happening right now?
When we got two competing authorities, the king is under the law. And so you begin the development, and that's when this understanding in common law begins to develop. So John is he's the one in the Robin Hood, right? He's the Robin Hood cartoon, right? That Robin Hood is fighting against, and he's stealing it. And so when the little rabbits say death to tyrants, right, they're talking about King John. That's a real king in history that was a real tyrant. So they end up writing the Magna Carta because they basically corner him, and they say, we've got to write down what are the rights and the laws, and you're going to sign it, and then you're going to act according to it. Now it ends up, he ends up signing it, then going back on it, and there's a tussle. And Henry, that you were mentioning earlier, he's between the writing of the Magna Carta the first time and then the 1297 establishment of the Magna Carta, right? That Henry comes in and he writes out the law theory that gets the Magna Carta moved into the law of England finally, right? So it's written, it's signed. It's gone back on. There's a fight between the authorities, and then by the end of by 1300, it is finally established as law over the course of from 1215 to 1297.
So that's not Alfred, that's Henry, right?
That's so John is King John, he's the one that first signs the Magna Carta, and then it is established as law by the king finally in 1297. So I think it's 2 kings later. So that's the Magna Carta, and the man who you were quoting earlier, Henry, is the one who develops or writes down the law theory that everyone
Henry Bracton.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
he writes down the law theory of common law between the writings of the two, between the writing and the establishment of the Magna Carta.
So you get the Magna Carta that happens because of King John. Henry Bracton comes in here. I think Devon, I think might have been his real name. So
interesting.
Yeah. So Henry Bracton comes in and establishes that law in between there that becomes accepted later.
The theory, right?
The theory.
He's the one that writes down. So because before this, the traditions and the laws are all they're there. The freedoms are there. They're in use. And what it is what is the commonwealth of all of mankind? That's what the law is supposed to defend, right? And then the law, it's called common law also because it applies to everyone, right? It applies. So
yeah, that's one of the things. It applies to everybody in every nation at all times. It wasn't a place or a people that it didn't apply to.
Right. There wasn't a people under the jurisdiction. Right. Everybody in the English speaking world was under the English common law, and the French had their law. And right. So it established these are the things that everyone here, this is common to all. So it's not like the king is under one law and the commoner is under another law. Right. So
I think the distinction I was trying to make was that the way they understood common law coming from natural law, the natural law applies to all men everywhere.
The natural law, exactly. The natural law applies to everyone. The common law is the working out in history of the conformity to natural law
in the location that they're currently at.
In the location that they're currently at. How do we? And so this is where their understanding was: you look at the law of the land, and then you say, how do we take another step towards maturity? And you do that in a legal way, right? By setting precedent in judgments, in hard judgments, the same way Moses did it, right? Moses did it by taking the hard laws, the places that bumped up against the edges of the law, and making a ruling that set precedent. That's what Deuteronomy is. They're rulings that set legal precedent, and you do it in the hard cases. That's where you develop our wisdom and our law, right? And that understanding is very anti-Gnostic, right? Because you're not imposing from coercively a new law. You are developing sort of an art of law that gains wisdom as it grows.
I guess since we're here now, there's kind of two things that you made me think about as you're talking about that. That's really good. But so help me understand. If someone now is excommunicated from the church, it seems to have no bearing whatsoever on the culture. None. Absolutely none. But as you're talking, we've seemed to have separate the government so much, it's become Machiavellian, that there's only really one real government and that's it, right? And you even see then that King John, right, is upset about the church excommunicating him, that he's trying to act Machiavellian. I got all the power, I'll shut down your churches.
Right.
So it's not like it's a new problem, but it was such an issue. If Joe Biden is excommunicated, he's not shutting down any churches because the authority of the church right now has no jurisdiction in American culture.
Right.
None. It's just like another entity of a 501c3. Who cares what a 501c3 says, as long as they don't tell you to vote?
Yeah, he might do something he might do something where they, you saw this with the use of the IRS by
with someone with Trump, right? I can't remember what that was.
Yeah, so the IRS does sometimes get weaponized, and the threat of removal of
somebody's
tax incentives involved in 501. But that
I haven't seen that on a church yet, though.
I've seen it discussed. People are like, why do churches get tax exempt status? We got to get rid of that. Look at all that tax money being flushed away for an old myth. You see that, but they don't understand how important it has been throughout history that the churches are not taxed, right? Because that gives them the position to rebuke the government when it's being unjust. Right? That's the point of a tax-free status.
Right.
The churches are tax-free without a 501c3. I mean, depending on the state laws, I guess there's probably differences, but churches just are automatically tax-free
by their very objective,
by their definition legally.
What they are.
The push to be a 501c3 was I think
failure,
an unfortunate mistake.
But why doesn't the Lord's table or excommunication from that have the gravity in our culture right now that it should? Because that's one of the harshest punishments a church could give to someone is to excommunicate, and it should have the same sort of discipline feel that a government, throwing someone in jail should, or even beyond that, like, okay, you can get killed for this, right? It should have some sort of real power to it. And I don't feel that in our culture. How do we lose that? Why don't we have that?
I think it's just because of our disunity, right? You walk down the street and go to a new church and you're restored without ever having to
repent.
Without ever having to repent. So that's our fault, right? It's because we've allowed the church to be divided up into so many denominations, right? And when denominations started, denominations were born because all of a sudden you have people's ability to move to a new landmass expanded, right? So all these people move to America. They all speak different languages, have different hymnals. They all have the Bible in their own language, and so you go in and you got the German Lutheran Church, you got the Scottish Presbyterian Church, and you got the English speaking Anglican Church, and you've got the Swiss speaking church over there, and they all speak different languages and have different hymnals, and so and denominations are sort of born out of that setting, not on purpose, right? Eventually the church splitting starts, and then you've got all sorts of other denominations that are born. But the way that if we can't acknowledge one another's discipline, then then expecting anyone else to doesn't make any sense. So here's a good example. So
that's a law problem too, though, isn't it?
Totally. We don't understand that the Baptist church around the corner has jurisdiction that we share. Right.
As elders, right?
So they're elders and have the same jurisdiction that we do, right? And so we are down in California, we had a situation where
I'm sorry, I'll let you go in just a second, but you just described, man, I'm gonna get so much hate on this. You described, whether people like it or not, Presbyterianism, right? Like whether you like it or if that's true, then there's unofficial forms of presbytery that are happening just by the nature of their authority.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is where but you don't solve this by everybody becoming Presbyterian.
Right. No. I'm just talking about the government of it.
Yeah. You solve this by getting into relationships with the other churches in your city, and then respecting one another's jurisdictions, and if somebody is ordained in a Baptist church, and my church refuses to acknowledge that ordination somehow, right, then I'm the one that is the schismatic, right? That's
right.
So here's a good example. So down in California, we had a lady come to our church, and after a couple of weeks, noticed that she's not taking communion, or one of my elders did. And so just said, hey, why are you not taking communion? And she's like, well, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I got put under discipline at my last church. Like, okay, so let's meet this week. We'll talk about it. You tell me the story. She tells me the story, and she's like, and I don't, I think they were wrong. And I was like, well, two things. Let me tell you. One, even from your story, they weren't wrong. But secondly, they have the authority to do that. So, which we fully acknowledge. They were a Calvary Chapel church. We fully acknowledge that they have the authority. So their ban or their excommunication applies to our table too.
Right.
And so, but I want to work with you to get you out of that, but it's going to require repentance, and you need to ask them to forgive you. And so I'll help you write a letter, but I'm going to get their side of the story too, so that I know that we're actually repenting of the right things. And she's like, okay, right. She was convicted and wanted to be taken out of church discipline and be restored to the table. But so I called the pastor and say, hey, this is Jason. I'm from the church over here, and so has been coming to our church, and she told me she'd been put on a church discipline. And he said, how dare you question our authority? And he hung up on me, right? and I was like, I don't think that's obviously, he did not know what I was going to say. All right. So I call back and I just leave a message. He lets it go to voicemail. I leave a message saying, hey, pastor, I think you misunderstood. We are upholding the discipline, and I want to know what it is she needs to repent of, so that I can encourage her to repent of whatever it is you put her under excommunication for. But we have refused her at our table. But I don't know how to counsel her towards repentance unless you tell me what the judgment was. He called back. He was like, I'm so sorry. This has never happened. Right. He said, I've been a pastor 20 years. We've been putting people under discipline. I've only ever gotten a call from another pastor that was upset that I had used church discipline. I was like, oh no, that's not. So even from her version of the story, she 100% you were right. But it's working, and she's now convicted. But she's convicted because her daughter brought her to our church. And when I said, as long as you're not under church discipline with your local church, she held back. Right. And so then I got to work with the pastor and the elders and help this woman write a letter of repentance and then deliver it and be restored. But in 20 years, he had never had another church uphold their church discipline. And he was he's a pastor that had been faithfully preaching the gospel and being faithful where he was, and in
Presbyterians work. That's all I heard. I just heard Presbyterians work. So is that what you said?
They only work if we have relationships and we uphold one another's.
But that's what I mean. Like, the idea and the concept is an inescapable concept, and when you function and operate within the law, it brings beauty, right? That's beautiful.
And it could work. I mean, it could work in a context where everybody's, Episcopalian of some sort. It could work in
Presbyterian is true whether or not you believe it or not. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? The Presbyterian government is true whether or not you believe it or not, right? That's just the way God's made the world.
Form of church government too. So.
Yeah, but I'm being funny. But in one way or not, I'm actually being serious in the way that there's some things that are inescapable, and we have to understand that pretty quick. So a pastor who's operating like that, even with a charismatic church who doesn't even fall in line with that at all, those realities are coming together and helping people flourish just like a rose or a flower, because they're honoring the way the law is ran, the way the law is done. And they're saying this person and that person is beautified because of that. Right. And so. Right.
Because the church is a public institution.
Right.
It's a public, but it's just right now it's a fractured public institution. So it can't function the way it ought to while fractured. Right. It's it's intended to function in a certain way. And I mean, I think the way that you do that is the pastors all getting to know one another in a particular city and then working there. And, we had, in Santa Cruz, they had the elders of the city, the evangelical churches, and they were working on bringing in other kinds of churches as well, functioned in such a way that the pastors all voted in elders of the city to try to function, because that's,
Did you say they voted? They voted in elders of the city, like a presbytery.
Yeah, I mean they just all agreed, like, we've got this, like, we can do this. And so you've got Baptists, Charismatics, Anglicans, I
love it,
the Presbyterians, right, all working together, and they're like, we're going to vote in the elders of the city because we are the city, the church of this city. And so, and it was beautiful, and it was awkward often. The attempts to have worship services together was beautiful and so awkward. And it was wonderful.
I love it. I do love it.
So, and I always, when it came time, I always asked if I could take the confession of sin, because I knew that unless somebody said, "Ooh, we're worshiping together, can I take the confession of sin?" there wouldn't be one.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So I was like,
that's brilliant.
And then just do my part and have made some great friends. We ended up sharing a building with some very charismatic folks that were kind of home church charismatics, and then the Assemblies of God Church, and the three of us shared a building and worked, because it's so expensive in California.
Yeah.
We're like high church Presbyterians and working with these groups and trying to, and we had to go in one Sunday, and I had to call my wonderful friend Brandon and say, "Hey, my friend, when you guys worship on Saturday, can you not throw glitter anymore? Because we have to vacuum it up." But I knew Brandon, right? He's my friend. He's a faithful pastor, faithful guy. And they had liturgical traditions like that involved glitter. And we had to figure out how to work with one another. And we were blessed by them. They prayed like they prayed with faith. They were wonderful folks. And that was something that I knew I needed to learn, and hanging out with them. Like, they prayed better than me.
Here's one. Yeah, well,
and then they could learn, like, maybe throwing glitter is not.
Yeah, maybe not biblical.
But Paul didn't who knows? Glitter. Maybe that's something I need to learn. We never talked about it.
Nah, I don't think Paul was worried about glitter.
Hey, my setup crew's getting tired of having to vacuum up glitter before church.
It's in the communion bread, bro.
Yeah. But he was a godly man, a godly pastor in a different tradition, and I had to learn a new language. He had to learn a new language so we could communicate, a new dialect, I guess you'd say.
Well, our terminology even. Yeah. One of the things that I've learned from being more Reformed, being Presbyterian, being CREC, I will say this: I've learned the beauty of ecumenism, right? Like, if you can do it the right way, most people think about that, and all they think about is the stuff that they're going to lose. They never think about the stuff that they're going, and so they think like, I'll lose this, I'll lose that, and it's like some of that stuff you probably need to lose, and it's not helping you, and a lot of the stuff you need to give, and so they don't think about the two. I want to move to something you talked about with me on the phone, and I had to stop you because this is going back to what were you going to say?
No, I'm not sure what you're going to say, because we talked about a lot of stuff.
I know, but I wrote it down because you brought it up earlier as it relates to, we were talking about John, and then we talked about Henry Bracton, who comes in here in the middle of that tiff and writes out what was agreed to for the most part in the Magna Carta, and then we have it coming to fruition. And so now, as in America, put a pin in that and just move all the way to modern America.
Yeah.
We talk about precedent completely different now than what it actually is. And you were explaining that for me. And I know it's kind of a jump from common law, Magna Carta common law, to modern setup, but I think that understanding what precedent actually is, because you've been talking about precedent the whole time with the law of Moses, right? Moses is hearing cases, the hardest cases that are out there, and then putting down this huge marker of this is the precedent for this type of judicious situation, civil situation. This is the precedent. Right. He's laying it out, right? And so now when we think about precedent, we think about as an individual who's it's enlightenment almost. It's enlightenment the way we think about it, where it's like a judge is sitting in and over the authority, making a precedent on how he thinks this thing should go. And then we're taking his authority over the authority and then reading another position into it, so that if it's a bad law, like we saw this with 2020, right? With judges saying, yeah, the government can absolutely force you to go home in your houses because he does have legal authority for emergencies to take away your ability to go outside and work and so on and so forth. And so judges set precedent that was okay. But that's not how we should understand precedent, though, according to the way we understand common law.
Right. And this is where, so in the Magna Carta is, sometimes it's called the first constitution. I don't think that's a helpful way to do it, to think about it. But because of that, there's many constitutions have been written, right? The idea that you've got to write things down, that is established really well. And when you get to our first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, that they're realizing you got to write things down, right? You got to write things down and all look at them and all agree upon them. That's really important. The way now, but that's because the understanding of law as setting boundaries that are negative, right? Negative boundaries. Don't go beyond this. Don't go that way. Don't do this. Versus laws that tell you what to do.
Negative and positive law.
Negative and positive law, right? Laws that say you must do this. You must buy car insurance. You must buy, right? That's the old Roman imperial law, right? That where law tells you what to do, not protects a space for you to live, right? So protects your freedom so that you have space to live. Law is supposed to tell you what to do in an imperial setting. We've moved into that imperial understanding so that you've got people saying you must do this, you must do that, and you get really goofy laws sometimes that are still on the books to this day. At some point I'll get to tell the whole world about a show that we're doing at Lore, a reality show that has to do with the law that's really funny, that has to do with like finding the goofiest, weirdest laws on the books, right? And because when you start thinking in terms of the law as the means by which people are made to live, right? So rather than the law as protecting a space for people to live, and then the gospel is the thing that is the means by which we are able to live, right? When you start to think of the law as the means by which people are able to live, the law is the things which gives us life, then you start establishing laws that tell people how to live. And now that's how we think of precedent. So something like Roe versus Wade, even as a precedent setting decision, it was used in a way that precedent shouldn't have been used, right? So when somebody is told like, no, you should have allowed this person to be able to get an abortion, for that to immediately overturn all of the laws in the states that didn't allow abortion, that's not how precedent works. That's not how that shouldn't have been the way that precedent was used, except for we had changed our understanding of
what
precedent the law means, as if a law can impose something you have to do, right? So and so this has shifted. It's shifted in our understanding of rights, right? So rather than rights being things that the government's not allowed to do, right? That's what a right to freedom is. A right is something that the government is a limitation on the government, versus something somebody is required to do, right? So if you have a right to a right to
this gets into healthcare. This is perfect.
Yeah, healthcare is a perfect one, right? If you have a right to healthcare, then that means somebody else can be forced to give it to you, right? Somebody else, a doctor can be forced to give it to you by law.
Well,
right?
not just that, the government is forced to make sure that you get it.
Right. The government is right. It's the same with a right to an education, right? You say something like it. But now, does the government have a right to keep you from getting an education? No, they don't, right? We have a right, because we ought to be free from the coercion that stops an education, but that's different than the government being required to give you an education.
Well, and though that's not even a category in which the government should by its nature have the ability to even think in, right? So the government shouldn't even have the category. Now, if and I'm talking about, I'm thinking of the tiers here. So the civil magistrate all the way up to the federal government is not even in their thinking on whether or not somebody's getting education or not, right? That's not even in their category.
It's outside of their jurisdiction. But when you have governments stopping, and so this is where it gets tricky, right? You have governments stopping children of slaves from getting an education.
Right.
They're breaking the law by stopping somebody trying to get an education, right?
But the problem, the law breaking isn't the fact that they're stopping them from getting an education. It's that they're interfering in their life in this way at all, right?
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. Is that the interference that's illegal, right?
Right.
But what happened was they said it was declared illegal. The precedent was you can't keep people from getting an education, right? That became an argument for why you must give them an education.
Right.
But that's a different argument, and it's a different view of law altogether, right? So then if that's the case, then by law, then you must take taxes and spend them in a particular way, right? And if you have as if an education is the commonwealth of all mankind, and that's the job to protect it. But that is not the part of the forced education is different than saying it's illegal to stop education. But that's what a negative law would be, right? The government can't stop newspapers from printing. Is not the same thing as the government needs to print a newspaper and give information out, right?
Yeah. So when you go back to Magna Carta and common law, what we're ultimately doing with common law and Magna Carta, those are negative in their function, right? So they're negative law in the sense that like the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, commit adultery, all those things, those are negative, right? It's not telling you, hey, you must make sure your horse and buggy are tied this way, right? There are responsibility and duties individuals have, and if they don't follow through that, then the law comes in and says, well, you're obligated to manage and take care of this person because you weren't being judicious in how you were handling the situation, right? Or not judicious, but mindful of loving your neighbor, which is the law, loving God, loving your neighbor, right?
Yeah.
And so with common law and with Magna Carta, they're working in the negative form against the federal government, what they can't do to the freedom to individuals, right?
They're moving in that direction.
Okay.
Right. So you don't read the Magna Carta and say, they've finally arrived at everything.
Right.
You read the Magna Carta and say, I see the direction they're moving.
Yeah.
They're establishing the things that are traditions and such. And the next, but the difference between the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights is recognizable, right? It has the common law has continued to develop and move. It was really legal theory. It was beneficial for legal theory to run into African slave trade, the African slave trade again, because the whole new set of questions come up, new hard laws come up, and the English, they begin by saying, well, no, we'll accept slave trade here. sure. But then the Christians, the evangelical Christians in particular, say, whoa, this is way outside the scope of legal common law theory. And the people that want to allow it, they want to put the slave trade under the economic law, and regulate it under economic law. And the Wesleyan evangelical Christians, they say, no, the laws about slavery go under the laws of freedom and rights. When they step on English soil, the rights that are common to all on the soil apply to them, right? They speak English, so the English common law applies to them. And there are people that make the argument that, well, no, it their property, so it goes under economic law. And that's where you have the push the push towards Wilberforce making in the law to making legal arguments. Now, the legal arguments are all based on common law, but then you also have you have people working in writing plays, writing poetry, writing novels, right, that are trying to get this understanding out to everyone. And here's what's really interesting, right? At the time, nobody wanted to put on plays in the poor neighborhoods, right? So there were some Christians that began writing abolitionist plays and putting them on in the poor neighborhoods. And the poor in England began to see that they began to identify with the African slaves and say, oh, well, actually, we're in the same position. We had to fight for our rights as the poor in England, right? To gain our human rights under common law. And they're not getting their day in court to claim their rights as humans in England, on our soil, speaking our language, right? They're not. And so the House of Commons, who are put in place by the poor, mostly the House of Lords are put in place by the wealthy, and the House of Commons are put in place by the poor, start getting pressure from the outside because of all of the plays and the poems and the novels that are changing the opinion, that are teaching people how to identify with these people as people. And then William Wilberforce is pushing on the legal side, and those two meet in the middle and put enough pressure on the House of Commons and the House of Lords for them to outlaw slavery and grant legally all the rights of an Englishman to the slaves. Because in America, we solved our problem with war. Our problem lasted a lot longer, right? Our problem was not solved in the hearts and the minds of the people putting pressure and then legally from the other direction. We had to, whether we had to or not, we did solve our problem with war.
This is why I agree.
That creates a deep rivalrous division that you don't get in some of the other places.
I think that's where we see the first real American Revolution. So there is the place where we need to have some sort of upheaval of, the law in order to be able to implement top-down type of...
the whole social order, right?
The whole social order, that's right.
The war is a real upheaval to the social order. Now,
which is interesting because if you go back and look at, this is where history is really interesting. You go look at that time, all the things that we've been talking about and the influences of thoughts and these ideas, they're taking the metaphysical realities. While you were talking too, I was thinking about this is why you have to dehumanize the people, is so that you can fit them inside of an economic environment versus a human one,
treat
right?
them like property. Yes.
Yep. And so that's, if you do that, then you can fit them inside an economical category.
Right. And you have people making the same argument in America, right? But you've got the abolitionist movement that is that's growing in America as well, and growing down south. Most of the abolitionist groups were down south, and it's and who knows, maybe given time that it would have been solved in a less violent way, which would have been
Well, I don't know what the American abolitionists, they were pretty violent. The American abolitionists seem to be fine with, this is where you have Frederick Douglass, who is sitting here a part of the American abolitionist movement and speaking at their events, and they're ripping up the Constitution. And Frederick Douglass is like, whoa, hey, I'm with y'all. But that's the very way out of this for us, is through the Constitution.
Right. And some of that is because I think Frederick Douglass was well studied, and not all the abolitionists were, right?
Good point.
Frederick Douglass he had gone and gotten himself an education, and was well studied. So
and too, if you look at it, it's like, well, if we do what you're talking about, the first people who are going to get hit on this is going to be the slaves. Like, if it comes to that, then it's like we are, which is kind of what happened during the moment of Reconstruction. You got people now who are considered property, and who, if they don't belong to anybody, don't have anybody to answer to, then I'll just mow them down. That's
right. They hadn't been sufficiently humanized in the imagination of the people as a whole, and that's a tragedy, and the church should have been leading the way, and that's you look back and you're like, well, that's the church's fault, right? The church is the one that should have been leading the way on that and failed to. I mean, because as you continue through the history, you have some really high points in the, like, you look at like the Harlem Renaissance. What's really interesting is the Harlem Renaissance had a really strong Christian flavor to it. Now it's taught as if that wasn't there anymore, right? That now it's taught as if it was part of the revolution, part of the move towards revolution, part of the move towards kind of radical democracy or something like that, communism. But if you actually read the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance itself that was popular at the time, there's a significant amount of Christian poetry in there, so the Black church was doing the work of preaching the gospel, working, transforming people's imaginations of themselves. But over and over, that economic argument would continue to rear its ugly head, right? And so you had the destruction of Black Wall Street, right? They start getting too much money, and you can go in and destroy it. What's crazy, it's the same argument that was made about the Jews in Russia, same argument that was made about the Jews, so all the pogroms in Russia,
in Germany too,
and it's the same argument that was made in Germany. Those people aren't real people. They can't have that much money. That's not allowed. The Jews can't have that much money. Same argument was made about the Black communities that were making a lot of money, getting really wealthy. It's like they had been dehumanized and turned into an economic necessity rather than a human neighbor in the imagination of the people. And the church hadn't done the work it ought to have done to transform the imagination of the people at a corporate level.
And that's exactly why I hate the New Deal. Because that didn't change. We became economic necessity there too.
Yep.
Right. And so, anyway, this is like Black History Month.
This is what's interesting. Like, it is Black History Month, but Booker T. Washington, this is one of the things that was really interesting about him, right? Because he understood he said, because it was in his day that they were losing voting rights. They weren't gaining them back. And he said, you know what? Just leave us alone and give us a couple of generations.
Well, that was Frederick Douglass. What do we do with the Negro? Because everybody was asking, well, if he's free, we got all kinds of problems. They could see all the problems what happened with the Negro if they freed him, right? And Frederick Douglass is like, you do nothing with the Negro, right? You leave him alone.
Booker T. Washington makes the exact same argument, right? He said, just leave us alone.
Yeah.
Right. We don't get a vote. We don't get a vote. Right. And he's sometimes blasted for this. But I think this was one of his really wise moments. He said, we don't get a vote. Oh, you're not going to give us the vote? Then just leave us alone. And he said, give us the freedoms that you have.
Yep.
And if with the freedoms that you have, we will prove ourselves indispensable.
Equal
right?
under the law.
Let us prove our humanity to you then, because he understood that's to deny a vote is to deny the humanity, right?
Right.
He understood that, but he said, if you don't want us to be a part of your system, just leave us alone. Let us build our own, right? Which I wish it would have happened, right?
Yeah.
Every time it happened, though, that the economic injustices, the economic definitions come back in and undercut the Black community again.
I know everybody wants to talk about the tragedies that happened in the Black community and with America and all of those. I can point to, I've studied them. I can point to so many. When I read all of these, my biggest problem with these tragedies, you can look at the Colfax in Louisiana, the Colfax massacre. That was horrific, right? That was probably the worst one. People don't talk about that. You got Roseland, you got Black Wall Street, all those situations. The biggest problem with all those situations weren't that they happened, even though that was a massive problem. It was that there was no justice for those problems. Yeah. That was the thing. It was that the law didn't work in the same way. And the fact that the law, so in Colfax, the way that Colfax operated, the law was used completely the opposite way, because you have, for the first time, you have the civil rights movement of 1864, 67, I think it was, one of those 64, 60, I think it was 1886, I think it was. It's 90 years before the civil rights movement. So count back for me, somebody do the math. And you have Black Republicans who win in Louisiana, right? And we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
And so they have won this office, and the white Democrats come there and basically kill everybody there because they're mad about. I'm giving them a short version of the story. The law then was used to say, because I think it was the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment that was just ratified and set into place. But the 13th and 14th Amendment, they said that the amendments only applied to the federal government, not to how individuals interacted with other individuals. So so the right to bear arms that they have, Second Amendment, right? Those amendments didn't apply, because part of what the white Democrats wanted to do was take away the guns that they had there that were protecting City Hall for the Black representatives that were in the place. Right. And so the 300 white Democrats come to take the guns away and to kill everybody and massacre everybody, which they did. But when it went to, because I think Grant was president at the time, but I think they found only 9 of the people. And they tried them. Nobody was convicted. And the reason they weren't convicted, because they said, well, no, the right to bear arms and the right to freely assemble and all these rights were given to and against the federal government and not to the local government, which, by the way, if it's true, then local governments then have a right to disbar you from bearing arms, which is what is happening right now in Hawaii. Right. As they're pointing to why you can't bear arms there or have a right to keep arms. So it's funny how, like, if you didn't fight for these rights here at this point in time and let the law misapply, right, the situation, because the right to bear arms is a citizen right, right? It's not just something the government can't impose, but it's a citizen right as well in the nation.
It's a right that the government is not allowed to undo, right?
Right.
And so it doesn't matter what government.
Exactly. Right? Exactly.
The civil government cannot undo that. It cannot take that away.
But this is the point, though. If precedent is set by something like that, well, that's the precedent. Then why can't Hawaii use that precedent?
Yeah.
Right.
But that's why you're supposed to have that's why the Constitution is so important, because it's the law of the land, and you're supposed to be able to go back to it and say, okay, this judgment was made and it sets precedent, but it set it in the wrong way, right? A new tough case can undo previous precedent, right? And our problem is, we haven't stood up and stopped it in the small moments. It's the same with gay marriage, right?
Right.
Marriage licenses were created so that you could stop interracial marriage. Right? That was the purpose. That was why they said we need some licenses. You have to come ask us, because these Christians over here, they keep marrying across racial lines, and we've got to keep our racial lines pure, because there were Nazis in America making laws and running things. So they create marriage licenses to be able to stop interracial marriage. And what is it, 70 years later, they're giving them to dudes and dudes. Right. Yeah. So like, okay, so we should have been up in arms at the first point, right? At the first crime scene, we should have been up in arms and saying, you have no right to require us to buy a license from you to be able to get married, right? That if Jesus says this marriage is okay, you don't have any right, because you're outside your jurisdiction. Beautiful. The sun came out.
I saw that. This is where, so going back to understanding what common law is, this is where I want to end on, because you're hitting at something when you said that this is something that Jesus has given us. So this is why the 9th Amendment right now is so important, because it's saying that there are rights that are not written down inside of the Bill of Rights, inside of the Constitution, that do not belong to the government, but belong to the people. Right. And so, but what the government wants to do is to try and write down all the rights that you have, which is why when they write out bills, they are thousands of pages, because they're trying to write out the laws that you get to have with this. And this is what some of the way that they are subversive in moving foundational laws by putting them into bills. Right. And so you got to be super careful about that. But one of the things that I think, so the reason we don't hear common law talked about hardly at all anymore is because common law is explicitly Christian.
Yes.
Right? Like you cannot talk about common law without talking about Christianity. They are almost synonymous. Common law in itself is explicitly Christian. And guess whose laws are based off of common law?
All of our laws.
All of our laws
were at one point. So, and this is the 9th Amendment. I figure we should read it.
Yeah.
The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That people made in the image of God have certain rights, and they've written down some of them. Right? They enumerated, right? Like they put them in a list. That doesn't mean that the ones that we didn't put in the list are not still their rights.
Right. So exactly.
And the problem is that how the 9th Amendment ends up being used is they've changed the definition of the word rights from things that the government is not allowed to stop to things that the government has to provide.
So that's something. So this is something that was really important. The way that it was said, I'm trying to say it right. The government doesn't grant you the freedom of speech, right? Right. Or grant you the freedom to protect yourself. The government acknowledges that those are rights that God has already given people. And then they are saying, we acknowledge and submit under that authority of God that these are rights that people have. That's what's supposed to be the situation. But the way that we think about rights is the government says that I have freedom of speech.
Right. The government has granted, promised me freedom of speech. And that's why you can say that people have a right to education.
Right.
And what that means is everybody has to pay into a fund that is then used to make sure everybody gets an education.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I believe that people have a right to an education in the other sense of the word right. The government is not allowed to stop me from getting an education. The government can't burn the libraries down or throw things out that it doesn't like.
Right.
The government has no jurisdiction in the library. Right. That's a different understanding, though, of rights. Right. So by letting the definition of rights be changed, we have let the law be change. The law becomes something that it wasn't intended to be.
So when we look at, so now when laws are being made, the reason you have, so I don't know how anybody in America can talk about foundational, constitutional forms of liberty and law without talking about common law. Right. So you can't. I don't think you can.
You can't. Yeah. That's why I sent you that text message about that summary of the Magna Carta, though, is because they were trying to say, the Magna Carta was important, but it was bad because it didn't actually center the rights in the power of the government the way that it ought to have. Right. So it didn't take care of the poor. It didn't do. It's like, well,
that wasn't the job of the government.
That's not the job of the government, right? That's my job as a neighbor.
Yeah.
Right. That's my job as a Christian. That's right. And I could, there might be a way, there might be a way to there are ways that the government is undermining
the
poor.
Yeah, they're supposed to support human flourishing
that need to be gotten rid of. But the revolutionary understanding and the common law understanding are so at odds that the revolutionary understanding has to get rid of common law and or completely redefine it into a new system.
So as we're talking about common law, because we're going to do this again next week, because I think we just kind of got a fairly good introduction into this. But what I'm trying to learn from this as we're talking about common law, Jason, is that there isn't any form and function that God's standard isn't applying to how we think about civil relationships.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what I'm thinking about. So when people are thinking about law, what they're actually fighting over right now is power.
Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Because there's no concept of there's no concept of jurisdiction. And so there just becomes raw power, but we're fighting over who has the raw power.
But what I'm realizing is that God has been working in time and space, in history, to mature us to a full man like Christ. And he's done that in some beautiful ways through certain spats in history that have bringing about clarity to natural law and helping us understand the relationship between that with special revelation and God's Deuteronomic law and Christ being the fulfillment of all those things.
Right.
So that we can like you did with that pastor, in relationship, not just at a federal government level or in a local government level, but even from person to person, what are our interactions and how are they supposed to be? And what is going to bring about the righteous standard along with human flourishing in a beautiful way, right? This is at the bottom of it is how do I love my neighbor? And
and this is it's that how do I embrace the jurisdiction God has given me with joy and gratefulness, right? And that's where we I think we waste enormous amounts of energy worrying about the federal government and thinking that that's where we solve problems. That's where we solve issues. Right. And now there's all sorts of problems at the federal level, but for most of us, it's outside of our jurisdiction. Right. But he did give us a jurisdiction. If we spend all our time worrying about somebody else's jurisdiction, we miss our own. Our job is to become wise in our own jurisdiction. Right. So that if, let's say, you borrow your neighbor's lawnmower and it explodes while you're using it.
Right.
You don't need a lawsuit because you know the wisdom of the law. And so it's my job to pay it to pay him. I borrowed it and it broke while I was borrowing it. If you rented it from your neighbor and it broke while you rented it, then it's his job. You don't owe him anything. You don't need lawsuits because you're wise. Or if your neighbors have a spat, they know you're wise enough that they can come to you and both say, hey, we need a neighbor's perspective. We're trying to figure this out. Can you help us? Right? You want to be that kind of guy on the block that can walk through the wisdom with people, right? So that that the law is within you such that the world around you becomes more just, right? We used to do this thing with our kids when they would get into a spat with one another, when they get into a disagreement, or it'd be like they couldn't figure it out. You'd say, okay, well, here, we're going to set up, let's everybody come to the living room. We'd set up the chairs and such, and that and Erin would be the judge. My wife would be the judge who decided who got to speak when, and then all the other kids would be the jury, and then each person got to give their side to the jury, make their argument, and then they had to take a vow beforehand to submit to whatever the jury decided, right? And so they would each have to give their side, and then they would get to counter, or they would get to ask each other questions, and then the jury would deliberate and make a decision, and by the time you got to the end of it, everybody was back in fellowship. You're having so much fun, and the kids are learning how to think wisely through things, and some of our greatest inside jokes have come from those issues. But we realized it became unfair when my 17-year-old started quoting Aristotle at her little siblings in those. We're like, okay, this is not fair anymore. But it was the whole thing is, you're trying to raise kids that never need a lawsuit because they have the law embedded in their hearts.
Well, and this goes back
that their jurisdiction becomes just, legal, gracious, joyful, because the law is written on their hearts, and they love it. They love justice. They love mercy, and they know the difference.
We should stop leaving law to experts. Mm-hmm. Right? Law yes. is not something that is for experts only. Law is for kings, right? Right. That's where we are, right? That's what we are. I wrote down here, I have a new insult now after our show today. One of my insults is to look at somebody and say, he won't be able to judge an angel.
Yes,
right?
Totally.
Right? Because what is it you need to know in order to be able to judge angels, right? You got to think about that. And if you can't judge between your kids, and you can't teach them God's standard, you can't judge between yourself and your neighbor, you can't judge between yourself and your boss, then you'll never be able to understand how to judge angels. That's some complicated stuff, right? That's some pretty complicated stuff. So in this that we're learning now, so and the same way that common law has matured and is maturing and moving on through time, so should we. So that when we come to a point, we'll be able to say, I know how to judge angels.
Right.
Right? And so, but yeah, we have left law to experts, and we need to stop that. We need to get ourselves saturated and baptized in God's standards and God's law, and the beauty of it, and learn to enjoy it, because it really is fun. Like it really is fun, because it's not something that, I need a case to happen. It really is just how you live and function every day.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's certain things I don't do because I'm considerate of the person who I might end up affecting if I do those things. Well, that I'm thinking through biblical standards of the axe head in that situation. I'm not intending to hurt anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody. But if I do something too crazy, would it hurt somebody if it just happened to take place? Well, then I'm at fault for that, right? And so it teaches me a way to love my neighbor that is broad and effective, and people are looking for safety. It's safe because I'm thinking about those things and not being, because that's recklessness, right? That's what's happening in that situation. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Right. Well, and I think it teaches you, it teaches you what you're not allowed to do to your neighbor, right? That teaches you the limits, but it also gives love a definition. It gives love content.
Yeah.
Right. We always want to say, hey, go love your neighbor as yourself. But the law is what gives that love a content. So what does it look like to love my neighbor, when if I go out there and he has accidentally left his, say his bike out on the edge of the street where it could easily get stolen. Well, if you find somebody's donkey wandering through your yard, you're supposed to return it, and if you don't,
then it's called HOA.
Right, exactly. We want to say we want to say whose jurisdiction is that? Well, I know it's not mine, right? But the law of love embraces jurisdictions, embraces your own jurisdiction. So you start taking responsibility for your actions, and then you start taking responsibility for your neighbors because they're your neighbors, right? That's where's my jurisdiction? Well, my neighbors are my family, my neighbors, right? The jurisdictions work out, but we want to work from the top down rather than from our personal jurisdiction out, which is what love embraces joyfully its jurisdiction and then works out and says, oh my gosh, my neighbor left his garage door open accidentally. I should pop over and, close it, or text him and say, hey, my man, you left your garage door open. Did you want it open, or you want me to close it? Can I do right? That your eyes, when you embrace your jurisdiction joyfully, learn the law, it lifts your eyes to be able to love your neighbor, because now love has a content. Love has content, that's where, you start to say, like, dang, my love is weak, right? My love is a flickering flame that does not burn hot.
It's almost lawless.
Right. And so then you ask God to forgive you, and ask God to grow it, and ask God to, because when you start learning the law, you find your own sinfulness real quick. But that's what Jesus died, right? So the study of the law becomes a joy, because it's, oh my gosh, look at another way God has been gracious to me. And then you learn how to be gracious and loving to others as well.
Where does metaphysics fit into law?
Well, that's what natural law is. Our metaphysical nature, when used properly, will flourish. The law is a description of how to use your own nature properly, use the neighbor of your nature well, when it's well written law, or when it's well.
That's kind of how you know. So like right now, people are writing laws on what they have to do to take care of the poor. Like I just read an article talking about Lyndon B. Johnson on the war on poverty. Well, that did not create human flourishing at all. No. Right. And so as we aligned ourselves with that, you can tell that the reality of how we're made and what he tried to do just don't go together.
Right. Well, yeah, at some point we should talk about how much money was poured into, like, the Bauhaus architectural movement by that war on poverty that created the projects, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's where the projects came from, right?
Yeah.
There weren't projects before that. In fact, they knocked down a bunch of black neighborhoods with single family homes, where you had mother and father and children, living together, owning property, and getting that economic leg up that property ownership gives. They knocked all that down in order to put up big Bauhaus projects and experiment on the poor.
But that's what happens when the government is interfering in something that they don't need to be interfering in, right?
Right,
like
right. Yeah, they're stepping outside their jurisdiction, and so people won't flourish.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we want, right? We want people everywhere to flourish. We want people to have the freedom to grow in wisdom, which means the freedom to sometimes make terrible decisions so that they can grow in wisdom.
And right? that's on the other side of it too. I see right now, and we're 2 hours and 14 minutes once again, but I see too a lot of black people complaining that the government handed out and helped middle-class suburbia, and so they wanted the same sort of handouts and hand-ups that they gave them. But I want to contend that those middle-class suburban handouts weren't helping. It all does the same thing. And so now what you create is they think they're accumulating wealth, but actually they're making a soft and weak people, right? They're making a docile and weak people because they didn't get it. They didn't develop it. They didn't work on it. They didn't have their hands in the dirt. And so what they got was a soft, and that's why we look at middle classness really soft. They became soft, and they became people who work for everybody else. And they're not now, they're actually very fragile. And so you have this one group of people who didn't have the handouts that know how to hustle. 2020 hits, and everybody who's hustling is like, ain't nothing really changed. We've been hustling, so hustling been the same for us.
Yeah.
You got rich people, they're insulated. They're like, well, we've been making everything. And then you got this gooey middle of people that hoarded all the toilet tissue paper
under the heat.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's totally it. And what's really interesting, part of the reason the middle class is going away is because it was easy to get in.
It's right.
To the middle class. And then once you were there, you just settled in. And there wasn't anybody that said, oh man, I got into a single family home with an unfinished basement because the government provided a bunch of them.
Yep.
And who's providing the next group? The single family home with the unfinished basement, no yard, there's no place, there's no entry point. All the entry points got plugged up by people that got into the entry point and then just settled.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I didn't like the law. Like, the law was a horrible law saying you can't sell houses to black people. Right. But that might've been a blessing in disguise. Right. Like, because what you end up seeing, so, you look at Black Wall Street. We got to quit. You look at Black Wall Street and nothing was handed to them in the worst possible environment you can have. And because of, you got a couple things that happen. You have, Indians who owned slaves who had land, and all of a sudden black people get land in Oklahoma because they open it up. So but you still had to work the land. You still had to do something with it. And then you have these self-sufficient, almost Malcolm X thinking type of black men that come into Oklahoma that say, this is going to be the new Mecca, right? And so we're going to work and you know what? We don't need none from nobody. They couldn't even, voting wasn't a thing. They couldn't do it. That already happened, fell apart in the Louisiana Colfax situation. So they're not doing it, but they built such an institution and industry there that it was self-sufficient and sustaining. It wasn't any way to tear and break it down apart from the lack of justice being implemented and applying equally under the law. That was the only thing that failed, was not having equal opportunity under the law.
Right. There wasn't justice. So had those folks been confident that justice would have been done, they wouldn't have ever attacked. Right?
That's exactly right.
They knew they were going to be able to get away with it.
That's right.
And that's where the problem was, is you had that justice ceased to be blind under modernism.
And here's the deal. It wasn't just lack of justice for black people. So in Black Wall Street, preceding that, just a few months before the destruction of it, there was a white guy going around killing people in taxis. And he got busted. The people were outraged and he went to jail. Put a pause in that. Just a little bit before that, a few criminals in this jail escaped out of the 4th or 5th story window. They fixed the bars, and then 6 more criminals escaped. People had lost all sorts of respect for their sheriff and the law there because he wasn't upholding the law there. He was flimsy. Yeah. And so when this guy who killed this taxi driver and was robbing his taxi drivers got caught, they didn't think that there was going to be any justice done to this guy. And so a mob of people, I should mention that the KKK kind of had a nice little handle there in Oklahoma. Nonetheless, Black Wall Street still flourished. But because of this, the mob shows up to the police station, to the sheriff's office, grab the guy, and publicly lynch this white guy. So the people are already outraged over the lack of law and civility inside of there. Right. They take over and become a law unto themselves and lynch the guy. And the police were the ones out there directing traffic for the lynching. Right. So it's not that law just wasn't being applied to black people. It wasn't. But it wasn't being applied across the board to anybody at that point. So of course the minorities are going to suffer.
And the thing is, when you've got a blind justice, right, then it gives people the ability to, blind justice treats everyone like humans, right?
Right.
And so when you've got a criminal, it doesn't matter what they look like on the outside, they're treated like humans. What happens is as the Enlightenment mentality and the modernism mentality takes over and scientism takes over, justice ceases to be able to say, we're confident everyone is the same. Everyone's a human, everyone's the same. Because science says you got to deal with people. You've got to look at the externals and find, and that's how you define people. There's not an internal nature, human nature, that everyone shares anymore. You've got just externals, and so people start judging according to skin color. Like that's not You don't have that all throughout history. You have that post-Enlightenment, post-modernism, right? You have the definition of races by skin color after modernism because they've lost that belief that there is a nature inside that everyone shares, right? That's a distinctly Christian understanding that is brought into the law. Right? You get old Roman law, right? There was citizens and there were barbarians.
Yeah.
The barbarians didn't get law, right? They didn't get equal treatment under the law.
Right.
Right. So that distinctly Christian understanding that everyone gets equal treatment under the law is what gives everybody the opportunity to flourish. Right. Everybody the opportunity to overcome their circumstances. And when we say, well, the government ought to give these people preferential treatment, like it did when it was giving white people preferential treatment, to then turn around and say, well, now it ought to give somebody else preferential treatment to make up for it. That's also not going to lead to human flourishing.
No. And we know what that leads to.
Under the law is a Christian understanding, and the law's job is to, there's definitely a lot of discussions that we need to have about what does it look like to restore and to restore property that was taken, and those are complex, important discussions. But unless we're getting at the equal treatment under the law,
you can't,
foundation that is foundational to common law, you can't solve any of the other problems either.
Jason, we're not even ready to have those conversations because we are severing ourselves from common law all the way. I think the fear that people have with having those conversations on reparations and restitution, I'll say it again, it's coming because of we don't know how to answer the question, so we got to get away from it and get away from law. The law actually has an answer for that. Biblical law absolutely has an answer for that. Common law has an answer for that too. But the problem is if you can't answer those questions if you're not a theonomist. Like you have to hold to an objective theonomic understanding of law to be able to answer those questions properly. You have to. Somebody just bought me some Chick-fil-A. Look at God. That's thank you, Anna. Just put Chick-fil-A right up here. You know what that means? I got to go. Yeah, because that's a law that you have to eat Chick-fil-A hot. It's a positive law, but it's very true. It's positive. Nah, man, but yeah, we can. These are not hard, and I'm watching people fight the social justice movement with absolutely autonomy.
Yeah,
it's like you're gonna lose.
They're arguing we ought to go back to Kant because the social
yes.
That's social justice, and you're like, And
then when I sit up here and ask guys, hey, are you a theonomist or not? They're like, I don't know about that. It's like, what are you talking about? Do you think that you're going to be able to really fight against the social justice movement, the woke movement? This is kind of why we're having this conversation, because I'm realizing, these guys are thinking in a whole different way. I don't even know if they know why they're thinking it, but some of the way that they think it, I think I'm finding conflicts with. And I don't know, if I'm honest with you, I'm like, why are their positions wrong ultimately, right?
Yeah.
Because the way that we fight back, it's almost like we're arguing over the flavor of vanilla. It's not an objective standard. We fight back with subjectivity, right? And the best thing that we have to fight back with, I think, is that we have some historical foundations inside of the American Constitution, which I think is great, but we have excommunicated that from common law, which goes back to Christianity, right?
Right.
And every Christian seems to be afraid to use Christian standards as law, right? Like they are afraid to, because they don't know how to, work those things out. They don't know how it applies case law. They don't know how to do it.
Right. And this is what I mean. We're going back to Kant, where Kant, he puts Christianity in the noumenal realm. That is separate from the phenomenal realm, where the realm in which we can interact and have experiences, where our senses are the way that we gain knowledge. So the noumenal realm is he puts religion up there, he puts metaphysics up there. That those are things that we don't gain access to with our senses, and then everything we gain access to with our senses, we have to use the scientific method for. Right. And so he separates those two things. And we're uncomfortable saying, well, God's law should affect our understanding of justice, because we have assumed that Kantian bifurcation of noumenal phenomenal. But the problem is a lot of conservatives are trying to argue for it again, where the social justice folks, they've rejected it, but replaced it with understandings of power and power differential.
Yeah.
That and we say, well, we're not gonna interact on power differentials, right? That's not good. That's not right. But then we're trying to back up into Kant, and so we say, but we actually need to back up into, I think, a historic common law tradition that says, well, no, let's talk jurisdictions, right? Let's talk like we can talk jurisdictions all day long. So power differential, that's a real thing in terms of like social interactions and stuff. But so if we've got a situation with an inverted power differential, all sorts of things cause problems, right? So you've got, a guy who's the manager hitting on the girl who is the waitress. She's in an inverted power differential where she feels like my job is at threat if I don't respond, right? That's a bad situation, right? Well, who has the jurisdiction to go solve it, right? That's where the question comes in. If he acts in such a way that she loses finances because of the power differential, right, then you've got a civil case, right? Because that's if she's just uncomfortable with it, right, you've got brothers, dads,
that's right,
that step in and say, hey, there's an inverted power differential. I'm going to come in here and explain that I don't want you acting according to it anymore.
And you might be losing a few fingers.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But who else has jurisdiction? The waiter, right? The waiter that's standing next to her.
That's right.
He has jurisdiction because that's his neighbor. He should go talk to the manager and say, hey man, you know how awkward of a situation you're putting her in, right? She's my neighbor, right? Right. But we have said, who has jurisdiction? Whoever has where's the highest level of power that we can get to get involved.
That's good, Jason.
We've stopped thinking in terms of jurisdictions and said, whose jurisdiction is it? There's all sorts of people for whom that sister is their jurisdiction because they're her keeper. Right. And the manager, maybe he doesn't realize it, and somebody points it out to him, and he can just be like, oh my gosh, you're totally right. I totally overstep my bounds. Maybe he doesn't, and you've got to figure out within the business, it's important for businesses to have really clear ways that they deal with power differentials because they're real, right? But the question of jurisdiction is how you deal with that in a way that that is not being dealt with within the social justice categories because they think in terms of power differentials only. And so then they think you solve a power differential by getting a bigger power.
Well, and right? They want to obliterate, the intent ultimately is to obliterate jurisdictions, right?
Yeah.
The intent is to completely obliterate so they can put a new jurisdiction in place, right?
But a lot of the social justice folks don't realize that, but that is where like queer theory, critical race theory, all of within that theory is embedded a desire to destroy all jurisdictions and re-relate everything in terms of power. But those things are in conflict now, right? We haven't lost that, but we don't restore it by trying to get the federal government to start acting in their jurisdiction without also just dealing in our own jurisdictions properly.
But that's all we've ever done, right? So that's all when you get away from common law, like ever since the revolution, that's all we've ever done. And revolution, I'm putting at 1861, right? Like that's since then, that's all we've ever known. And so that's why I think people really have to read Doug Wilson a little different on this topic. Like it or disagree, whatever, he's making a point here, I think, that few people, age of entitlement, he makes the point too in his book that he puts it the civil rights movement, and I think that those civil rights movement and the revolution are a sandwich. One side.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right. Starts the whole thing, gets it ready. The other side, slather, gets it ready too, and it comes together. And what you have in here is laws completely obliterated by one law, institutionalizing a system, and then a domino effect to the culture because of it. Right. So you get.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting too, because both of those used Christians and used the church.
Yes.
And even the language of the church, but by the end had squeezed out
all the Christianity from it.
All the Christianity. That's really interesting. I didn't have to think about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in one time. Okay, my Chick-fil-A is getting cold.
All right. Yeah, go.